Good evening, everybody. I hope we're coming to you live now with a good picture and audio. Can anybody confirm that they see and hear me? Great. So anyhow, welcome to the Westdale Theater. As you know, we are an independent nonprofit theater based in Hamilton, and unfortunately closed, as you can imagine, during this period of time. And what we're going to do is continue with these live talks about film. We have film book clubs, we have music clubs, we have lots of wonderful things going on here. And very excited to talk with everyone tonight about one of my favorite films and one of my guests' favorite films. So on Monday nights, we invite filmmakers and other people to come and talk about their favorite film. And this is also an opportunity for you to ask questions and comments about the film. Tonight, we're going to be talking about What's Up, Doc? 1972, directed by Peter Bogdanovich, and of course starring Barbra Streisand and Ryan O'Neal and Madeline Kahn's first movie. And our guest tonight is Harris Goldberg. And Harris is a Hamiltonian. I don't think he was born here, but I know he was raised here, and in fact went to Westdale High School. So there's a lot of associations to Westdale. Harris spent many years in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. He was a very successful Hollywood screenwriter, involved with a bunch of movies you probably have heard of. And Hamilton is very happy because Harris is back. Harris has been invited to begin to teach film at McMaster University. He came back in January, taught a very successful class last spring. McMaster's thrilled to have him. They're talking to him about doing more in the fall. And of course, he continues to do his screenwriting, and Harris is a director as well. He's also directed a couple of features. So anyhow, let's just get started by talking about the film. And of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the people involved and Bogdanovich and how this all came to be. But I think I'd love to hear first from Harris, kind of just, when did you first see the film? I mean, how did this first become part of your awareness? 1972, was it something you saw in the theater, or was it a little after?
I actually did see it in the theater. By the way, hello everybody. It's good to see you, Fred, and everybody. I actually did. It was one of the first movies I ever saw, and I got to tell you, even at that young age, I thought it was hilarious. And subsequently, I've seen it, quite a few times, and every time I see it, it's held up. The pacing, the humor, the performances. I just think it's like a real gem, and he really nailed it. I mean, I have to say, I was talking to Fred a couple of times. I know Peter quite well over the years, and so he's quite an interesting. He's quite a fascinating guy, complex, very talented, but kind of his own worst enemy. He's become a very
Well, let's talk about Bogdanovich, because I agree he's had a very unusual career, because he started out as a sort of a boy wunderkind. I mean, this was, he was an actor when he was 15 or 16. He was directing theater at 21, with Clifford Odets. I mean, and of course he became a big success very quickly. And in my mind, that run of films, 71, 72, 73, Last Picture Show, What's Up, Doc, and Paper Moon is that's one of the three, that's an amazing run for three films in a row. So how did you come to meet Peter, and what was that like?
Well, when I got to LA in 87, 88, I very quickly, within the first 6-7 months, became very friendly with Charles and Bob Evans. Mostly Charles. Yeah. Charles was Bob's brother.
Right.
And Charles, was living the Hollywood lifestyle, and I was basically, I had met him playing tennis, and we became, I was always playing 5-6 times a week with him,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
then he would play at Bob's house. And so I sort of got
Bob Evans, we're talking about, of course, was the head of Paramount during these days of the 70s and was making incredible movies at Paramount. This was a Warner Brothers film, What's Up, Doc? But Paramount was doing The Godfather like the same year, and Rosemary's Baby and Chinatown and all those movies.
I
Right?
mean, it was
But
really a magical place. You know, we'd go there and
it was an
we'd have,
incredible time in Hollywood because you had these filmmakers running the studios, right?
yeah, you would meet everybody, you know, the old, you know, the Dan Melnicks and they'd all talk about, there was no cell phones back then. There was no, you had to talk to people and you'd make your, talk about story and in these social settings, and that's where the business would come from. So as a fly on the wall, being allowed to hang out, that's when Peter started coming over. And Peter was having kind of a rough,
Yeah.
he was going on his downward because he
Yeah.
had this a lot of bad luck.
Yeah.
And the thing about Peter, when you met him, if you actually look at early interviews with him when he was on the Cabot, when he was at the height of his height, he was a pretty cocky guy.
Yeah, he was always a very cocky guy, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
So
Very
yeah,
New York, grew up in New York. His father was an artist. He was an intellectual. And when you took those guys and you put them in Hollywood, you know, they thought they knew a little bit more than the
yes.
average bear, right?
And he was started out as a he wrote for Esquire. He was a film critic basically.
That's right.
So,
He worked for Esquire. And he got to meet all these great, you know, John Ford and Orson Welles. He was friends with Orson Welles.
yeah, so he was one of these guys who kind of by osmosis, he thought he was, but he was. And then when he lucked out with the Last Picture Show, which was McMurray,
Larry McMurtry, yeah.
McMurtry, you know, he just sort of tapped. You know, he had this great knowledge of. He's a history buff, so he knows everything from the silent films to the every. I mean, he's just one of these guys who can, you know, take little gems from everybody and it's in his head. But when I met him, he was really struggling.
Yeah.
So he would tell stories, and they were kind of like the repetitive same stories over and over again. And so you would hear them over and over again. And you know, we started playing together, and I liked it because I felt, and I didn't realize how big he was.
Yeah.
And so when you saw, as you were saying, Fred, to have a 1, 2, 3 within a few years of a successful film, feature film at that time, which was even was miraculous. And I mean, like you were saying, the only other person to really have done that in that sort of same way was Coppola.
With the Conversation and the Two Godfathers, exactly. All this stuff. But I think you're right, Harris. I think it's a tribute to also to how Hollywood was run at that point. So the story, as I know it, is that the head of Warner Brothers was a guy named John Calley. And Calley was like a Bob Evans. These are young guys who were, you know, really loved film or passionate. Daryl Zanuck Jr. was over at, you know, Fox doing this. And David Picker was at United Artists. And they would just decide, you know, this is a film that should get made. And they would say yes. And of course, then the film would get made. And they let directors do their thing. Of course, the budgets were like $3 million, you know, $4 million. You know, it wasn't like, you know, the huge budgets we have now. But the story, at least as I've heard it about What's Up, Doc, is John Calley actually, you know, invited Bogdanovich in to meet him and said, Barbra Streisand has seen Last Picture Show and wants to do a movie with you. What do you want to do? Barbra Streisand, to remind everybody, was a huge star at that point, even though she was quite young, because she had done Funny Girl, right? And she had won the Academy Award for Funny Girl. But she had actually never really been an actress. The only movies she had ever done were musicals, right? Where she was sort of, you know, just doing the musical that as it had been done before. And I think they had, like 2 months to write the script or something, or 3 months. And they're shooting. You know, they were like green lit before there was even a script. You know, and you can't.
I mean, it's to hear Peter say it. He would say the fall. So when he finished Last Picture Show, you know, I think everyone was very surprised how well it turned out, because, you know, even turning it black and white, that was just because Orson Welles told him, because they didn't want to do black and white. They're like, you know, we're a color studio.
Nobody wanted black and white. Yeah.
No, but Orson Welles says, do it black and white. He goes, why should I do it black and white? And the reason was because he says, because performances come off better at black and white in that sort of weird way. And so, he managed to do it. And it just was one of those that hit a sort of, I mean, a lot of people didn't know about it, but it was making the rounds, at that time, because when you would go over to people's houses,
Yeah.
everyone, there wasn't DVD, there wasn't, so you would get a print, a 35 millimeter print, and they'd say, hey, we're screening Last Picture Show and so you go over to Bob's house or somebody's house and sit in their theater and watch the thing. So it became kind of a social thing. So what happened is McQueen.
Yeah, Steve McQueen saw it, right?
Steve McQueen saw it and thought, I want to work with this guy because he liked the performances.
Yeah.
So McQueen said, I'm doing a movie called The Getaway, which everyone should remember. And he goes to Bogdanovich, I want you to direct it. Yeah. So he was set to do that.
Wow.
John Calley then heard from Streisand, who heard from McQueen. Yeah. Then McQueen, who was #1 box office then, loved this new young director. So she goes, I want this young director. Yeah. And so that's how John brought him up, and he didn't want to do another drama.
No, that's right. Yeah. No, he had the idea of a screwball comedy, obviously. That was Bogdanovich's idea.
Because his favorite film was Bringing Up Baby. And he was Cary Grant in that. Yeah. So when he saw Barbra Streisand, he goes, I want to do a screwball comedy. Remember those ones?
Yeah.
And she's like,
what's that? Yeah.
But he was so cocky at that time. He would stand up to Barbara and just say, listen, this is what I want to do. If you want to do it, great. If not, no problem.
Yeah. And those of you who don't know Bringing Up Baby, that was a fabulous. Cary Grant plays a professor, kind of an absent-minded, very similar to the Ryan O'Neal part. And then the kind of daffy dame was played by Katharine Hepburn, and that was a great, very, very great success at the time. But of course, they had no screenwriter to write it, right?
Well, Peter then hooked up with Walter Hill. And Walter Hill was an assistant director who then became a very good action writer and director. Beverly Hills Cop, Hard Times with Charles Bronson. I mean, really talented guy. And they wrote the first draft, but it wasn't very good. And then they brought in, I think,
it was Robert Benton and David Newman.
Correct.
They were also working at Esquire. They weren't screenwriters either, really. And Robert Benton, of course, went on to become a very good director as well. And they wrote a draft, and I think in 3 weeks. And that was sort of the draft that Streisand read with her boyfriend at the time, Ryan O'Neal. And they said yes, and that was it. But what I was always impressed by, and I really think probably was the secret sauce to the script, of course, was they brought in Buck Henry. Mm-hmm. Now, is he someone you ever crossed paths with?
Yes, I've met Buck about 10 times.
Yeah.
And one of the, great
writer, great comedy
writer, if not the greatest, one of the greatest comedy writers.
Yep. And an actor.
I mean, if anything, he wrote, co-wrote, I guess, The Graduate.
Yep. And he created Get Smart with Mel Brooks.
Right. But what happened was when they brought in Buck, he did the page 1 rewrite of the Newman Benton script, and he's the one who that was basically, and he would say, Peter would say stuff like, originally they had written the 3 suitcases. If people see the movie, it's basically these 3 suitcases are going around. And Buck Henry called, he would say, and said, I think we need another suitcase. And at that time, I think the Pentagon Papers were.
That's right. Big. It was just at that time at Daniel Ellsberg, right?
So they said, well, why don't make one of the suitcases something like the Pentagon Papers, make it some government guy, and shove it in there. And so, it was a lot of moving parts.
Oh my God! Which suitcase? Let's get them all. And I've heard that they cast Michael Murphy in that part because he looked like Daniel Ellsberg.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Michael Murphy either at that point.
But to Peter's, I don't want to say genius, but to his, what he made sure is he and Buck said, let's make sure even though no one's going to know and they're not going to follow it, let's make all the suitcase stories exactly, let's play it legit so they follow. So if you actually slowed the movie down and watched each suitcase from A to Z, it would actually make sense.
Yeah.
And I think it resonates in the movie because it's so much fun to watch these 4 suitcases going in and out of the hotel and this and that, that it really creates a great pace. So
Yeah, well, that was, I think, what was so great is that, first of all, it had that breakneck speed, that all these kind of screwball comedies did. That even if there was a slow plot moment, it didn't really matter because you'd be past it and onwards so fast. And then, of course, the physical comedy, the chase, all that stuff. People hadn't seen that since silent movie days, Buster Keaton type chase stuff, right? And I don't know, do you script that, or is that just something you put then the chase starts? I know that there was the big party scene, right, at the millionaire's house. From my understanding, all the scripts said, now there'll be a fight, which will be brilliantly directed by how do you write comedy,
well, that's a good. Well, first of all, that's a great point. Actually, what Peter would say is like the big chase in San Francisco that happens at the end of the movie with all the cars. So that's about 12 minutes of screen time.
Yeah, that's huge.
But it took them a month to shoot that 12 minutes, and it was a quarter of the $4 million budget.
It was
So
just
when you think about it,
yeah.
I mean, just
that was his tribute to Bullitt, of course, if everybody remembers that Steve McQueen movie. But I think
that's a whole movie. A month of shooting is in some cases.
But just
small.
And there's still scars on those steps in San Francisco. They actually did damage shooting there, and it was very infamous, the way they used their locations and everything else. But
I think
as a director and a writer, how do you put that in a script? Can you script that, or do you just sort of? Well,
I think for anyone listening, and certainly you had another 10 to 15 years more of this than I did.
Yeah.
But I think we got the tail end of when you were making movies back then. It was sort of like, hey, let's put on a show, and you got these great minds and these great creative people, and you just kind of jumped into it, and sometimes magical things would happen, as opposed to today where everything has to be storyboard and
they'd have to do a pre-visualization or something before you could shoot it. Yeah.
But I think to Bogdanovich's credit, when he did that chase scene, he had such an intricate knowledge of every Keystone Cop thing, every gag that Buster Keaton had done.
The plate glass.
And he would go, hey, can we do this? And they would take 3 days to set that up. Or if they said, hey, you know what? Remember the so-and-so, the Harold Lloyd did this and this? And they go, well, we could check it out. And they'd send his crew out. And then sometimes they would steal the shot, as opposed like the cars that are going down those steps. They had no permits for that.
Right. That's right. It was a completely different attitude. It was almost like independent film today.
Yeah.
But instead, you had the biggest box office star around in Barbra Streisand, and of course, Ryan O'Neal was no slouch, right? He had done, first of all, he had been a big star in Peyton Place on TV, and he had just done Love Story for Bob Evans, right, with his wife.
Bob, if you talk to Bob, the reason they did what they wanted, they wanted Ali MacGraw to play.
Originally to play that part.
The Barbra Streisand thing.
Oh,
and Bogdanovich said she's not a comedic person, so he put Ali into The Getaway.
Yeah.
And they brought in, so that's how it got.
Very incestuous, which of course was the Steve McQueen movie that they wanted, but. So and of course, Ali MacGraw was cast in Love Story because she was Evan's girlfriend, right? And,
but to go back to your point about Ryan O'Neal, like when you look at what he's become now, he's sort of
I know.
I mean, he really had comedic chops. I mean,
he was a big star in his day, and then of course, 3 years later, he was doing Barry Lyndon for Stanley Kubrick, who's no dummy, and we could have a long conversation about that movie, but. But it's funny, but he really wasn't able to keep it going. I think there was something about being too good looking or whatever his situation was that, ultimately, he continued working, of course, but I don't think he ever had the big successes he had in the early 70s, right? That was probably his biggest success. Right?
Well, that's what's neat about Peter is that when you meet Peter now, he's learned so much and he's so reflective about who he was before, that he's talking about a guy where he goes, this is where I made my mistakes. This is where I screwed up. This is what I should not have. and it's like a guy who's become very wise in his older age,
Yeah.
and he's not bitter. He's more philosophical about it. So it's quite an interesting.
Well, I always thought the secret weapon of Peter Bogdanovich was his first wife, Polly Platt.
Yeah.
Because Polly Platt was a production designer and a costume. In fact, she was both the production designer and the costume designer on this film. But she was actually much more than that. She really was sort of a producer. She's the one who found the little book that became Paper Moon. She's the one who first ironically recommended Sybil Shepherd for Last Picture Show, who of course Peter wound up having an affair with, and it broke up his marriage, right? But she was a brilliant person, and later went on to partner with James Brooks, right, at Gracie Films, and both produced films. She's the one who introduced James Brooks to Matt Groening, and that's how The Simpsons got started.
Well, I think you just hit on something big, which is, you know, Polly, who passed away
Oh, I didn't
early.
know that. Oh, yeah.
She had cancer, but Polly was really Peter's, you know, right? She was what Alfred Hitchcock's wife was to
Yes,
him.
yeah, good.
She centered him. She was common sense. She allowed him to be, and then, you know, as soon as he started dating the Sybil Shepherd, you know, the actress, that was sort of the beginning, and he'll admit it. That was the beginning of the end, because he got rid of his anchor.
I always felt if he had stayed with Polly Platt, he would have done much more with his.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right.
Well, they always say behind every great man, there's a woman, and she never got the credit. You know, she was never given the credit I think she really deserved for all. I mean, she got credits on the movies and stuff, but I think she was really key to Peter's success, and certainly during this period of time. There's no question about it. Part of it, I think, that made this film so amazing was the performance of Barbra Streisand. I don't think anybody realized what a talented I mean, no, it's hard to say she won an Academy Award, but what a talented actress she was. And in fact, I remember reading somewhere her saying that, you know, this was the first time she was ever directed, you know, that director actually knew how to tell her what to do. And I mean, she'd worked with William Wyler, you know, on Funny Girl, but she was, you know, basically redoing something she had done on stage, or when she did Hello, Dolly, or, you know, the first couple of films were all musicals. And Bogdanovich, of course, was an actor before he became a director. So I think he really understood actors and how to, you know, and how to direct actors. And I think you see it in Streisand's performance.
Yeah, I think, you know, he was smart. I mean, he cast, it was Madeline Kahn's first role.
Exactly.
She was hilarious. I mean, really, she was,
yeah.
Howard, you know, I mean, just her delivery was, I mean, and she didn't realize she was funny. She was a serious Broadway actor.
That's right. She was a serious theater actress at the
and it was only Peter.
And then she went on to do all those Mel Brooks movies, where she, of course, she became a big star. And she was also, people may not remember, she's in Paper Moon. She actually got a Best Supporting Actress nomination for Paper Moon, along with Tatum O'Neal, who actually won, of course, for Best Supporting Actress. But Peter used her again in a more dramatic role. Great talent.
And I think he hit it. I mean, he was a real actor's director. I mean, he really was. He cast well. I mean, even you know, Paper Moon, to cast to come up with, you know, Ryan O'Neal's daughter, 8 years old at the time. I mean, she never acted. And
I told her was a horrible person. Not the easiest person, but she had something, obviously. Yeah, but I thought Barbra Streisand was just so fabulous in this movie, and just you know, obviously, you know, made this, because there is something about stars and stars' faces and stars' personalities that really is, I find, like, you know, especially movies like this, you have such immediate empathy, you know, and such connection with them. You know, even the fact whether they're talented or they give a great performance, you're watching someone you sort of innately is lovable and you care about. So she brought all that to the movie before you even saw her the first time.
Well, I think I became a fan of hers from this movie.
Exactly.
She was attractive and quirky, and, you know, I kind of went, geez, I wish I could meet someone like that, you know. And the thing that struck me by both of them is they were able to, they had that Marx Brothers delivery, which is not easy.
No, it's not. It's very, very technical, and the dialogue was being delivered so quickly and fast, and that's not easy to do. That's going to be very difficult to do.
Yeah. I think he was lucked out. It was one of those perfect storms. Even if you ask Peter, he'll say it was the best film experience he ever had in his career.
Yeah, that's what I've heard, is that he had a lot of fun doing it, and I think it becomes evident that, you know, in the movie. And you're right, it is that magic chemistry, the stars align and something magical happens, and they were left alone to go and do what they did. And again, the casting, I love Kenneth Mars in this movie.
Yeah.
You know, he plays, what's the character's name? Hugo, I guess, the other scientist. And Kenneth Mars, who you guys, if you don't know, you'd recognize him. He's a brilliant, he'd been in The Producers. He was the crazy Nazi screenwriter in The Producers, and Mel Brooks used him often. And supposedly he was the only one allowed to do any improvisation in the movie. Everyone else had to do the script almost exactly, but a lot of his part he actually improvised. And Bogdanovich, again, was smart enough to let him do it, because, you know, they knew how brilliant this guy was.
And he brought in Austin Pendleton. Remember that guy?
Yeah, Austin Pendleton was in it. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're right. The casting is always a huge part about this, right?
But those were days when, you know, a director would go, you know, would cast out of New York, you know, so
Yeah,
he gets some New York actors, and then he put those with some, you know, LA actors, and the mixture of the two, I think, made for an interesting combination, because you sort of had very well trained theater guys who are coming up against guys who are just, you know, basically feature performers, and so that's a neat mix. Sometimes you can get a
and of course it was amazingly successful. So the budget was supposedly $4 million. It made $66 million when it was first released.
which today would be what, do you think?
Oh, I don't know.
Hundred.
All you have to do is the percent 40, you know, even in those days, 60. And then it was re-released again the following year, did another 6 million. So it was the third highest grossing movie of the year, behind The Godfather and The Poseidon Adventure. But, you know, and again, a small little comedy versus, you know, some big important kind of film. But, you know, I'm always amazed at, you know, how they did these films so inexpensively. Well, obviously, actor salaries, people's salaries aren't what they were now, but that I think a lot of the efficiency and the reason they could do it lower budget was because they didn't have a lot of interference, right? They kind of just got on with it and went and, you know, made the movie, and didn't have to, you know, do thousands of retakes and hundreds of takes of everything, because the producer was going to re-edit it later, and, you know, it was just a simpler, kinder world, I think, right? You know?
Yeah, I think when you look at if you actually break it down, and you look at you know, it's actually quite a simple film, because it's,
Yeah.
you know, it's predominantly a hotel. It's predominantly
That's true, except for the big chase scene. Yeah, yeah.
racing, but other than that, it's a lot of great talking heads and performance, and, you know, compared to what you have to do today.
Yeah. No, everyone wants spectacle and fancy production value, or
Yeah.
I don't think there was probably a visual effect in the entire movie, right?
I except for the the Warner Brothers What's Up Doc animation.
Oh yeah,
That's
yeah.
what-
You know, the What's Up Doc is very funny. You know where that came from? It actually came from Tex Avery. Well, Tex Avery was the Warner Brothers animator who first came up with Bugs Bunny. And at least according to him, that's a very common Texas. He grew up in Texas, of course. And it was a colloquial expression that Texans would say to each other, "What's up, Doc?" And he stole it from that, you know, growing up as a kid.
Yeah.
And when he created Bugs Bunny, that he thought that was a perfect, you know, kind of, you know, premature, you know, for what Bugs Bunny represented, and he would use it all the time. And I think the other thing, as you were saying, is the way Bogdanovich would actually reference other movies, you know, both in dialogue and visuals, you know. And I think there's scenes in San Francisco and some of the shooting in San Francisco that even reminds me a little of Vertigo, you know, in the way Hitchcock used San Francisco. I mean, you know, you could see all these different things that he had seen in his past, and he would, and of course there's that wonderful line where Barbara says, Barbara says to Ryan O'Neal, "Love means never having to say you're sorry," and Ryan O'Neal says, "That's the dumbest thing I ever heard."
You know, he tells a funny story about, I think it's actually on YouTube. where, if you remember that scene, she says, "Love never means never having to say you're sorry," and then she sort of blinks her eyes.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Well, she didn't want to do that,
Okay.
and Bogdanovich said that was sort of our last sort of head-to-head thing. And he says, "Look, do it. It's going to be funny and cute." And she said, "No, I'm not doing it. I think it's stupid." So he'll then say she went around to every crew member and said, "Is this funny?" And she said the line,
Yeah,
"Love
yeah,
me."
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And people go, "Yeah, sure." But she didn't want to do it because it became a pride thing. If she felt like it wasn't funny, Bogdanovich said, "Just do it." And so he said, "Just do it one time, and if it doesn't work, I won't use it." So he got her to do it one time, and it actually was pretty adorable, and it
It
made the picture.
was. No, I mean, the other thing I heard is that she had these long fingernails, because that was sort of her style, right? And Bogdanovich says to her, "Well, you can't have long fingernails. You're beautiful long nails. You're a college kid, right?" And it was what she refused to cut her nails. So what he did is in almost every scene, she's carrying something. She either has a suitcase
Oh,
or
I didn't know that.
with her arm, and she's he would make her do stuff so people couldn't see these beautiful long fingernails that would have been totally incongruous with the part she was playing. And that was one.
Let me ask you something. Do you think, having had that monumental early success, and then really had the tail end of his career was pretty, up and down, and do you think he's got to be, I don't know, down about it, or do you think he
Well,
has?
I don't know. I don't know him, but of course, the guy I worked with, Francis Coppola, all those years, it was not unsimilar, right? Coppola had this brilliant career and 5 Academy Awards by the time he's 34 years old, and he never, Apocalypse Now, of course, but he never really continued that success on into the 90s, and he was very bitter and frustrated about Hollywood and filmmaking and cinema and yeah, I think, but I don't think this is completely unusual. I think that there are other artists and musicians and writers who often have this kind of, brilliant period in their late 20s, early 30s, where it's like they don't get in their own way, right? They just sort of, they channel the muses, their energy. It's just all comes together and it happens, right? And later in life, it becomes more difficult. They become famous, they become rich, they become, maybe a little self-indulgent in terms of the work they do. And it's hard to recapture that magic, that happened in their early life. And I think, we see that a lot. In fact, it's the rare ones that actually can continue to be that creative and that brilliant, further on. And Bogdanovich, he also edited his own movies,
Mhm.
this one, though, of course, the editor was Verna Fields, who was a very famous, not at the time. In fact, this, I think, was her first big picture. And there weren't a lot of women editors around, and Marcia Lucas was one of the other big ones. And of course, Verna Fields is most famous for editing, Jaws, right? And that's how she became really famous. But she said, he really basically edited the movie in the same way he did all his films. He was a real student of film, as you said, and really knew film and knew what he wanted, and a lot of times that's what, is the biggest problem for actors, is when they don't know what the director actually wants, right? Or the director's not able to communicate what they want. And the sense I get here is what Peter could, he could actually tell people what he wanted, right? And that's and with comedy in particular, that's important, right? Because sometimes people just don't
So let
know.
me ask you this: in similarity to to Francis, and
Yeah.
do you think what happens is once success hits, they start to want to replicate it? They start to get maybe frightened of, what if I blow it? Whereas initially they kind of went for it.
Exactly. They don't care, right? They can take risks. They don't care. I don't know. I think it has to do it has to do with ego, and once you develop that, this is again a theory, that applies to artists in general, is that as you develop that sense of ego, that connection with the other, the muse or the unconscious, there's too much noise, right? So you know how like musicians often, you know, the very first album they do is their best album, right? Because it's just original songs about themselves, and then as they become famous musicians, you're right, they're trying to please their audience, or they're trying to emulate something they did in the past, and it just gets in the way of the process. I mean, look at Ernest Hemingway, you know, the most brilliant, prolific writer, and he actually had a lot of trouble writing later in his life. He wound up committing suicide, right? Because he was so frustrated, he couldn't sort of write anymore. And so I don't know. And then, of course, the business itself is such a hard business because, you know, by the time the 80s roll around, nobody even, you know, remembered Peter. You know, the executives had come out of Harvard or whatever. They don't, you know, oh, Peter, oh, you're the guy who did that movie, that black and white movie in 1971.
Yeah.
And they kind of have this position that you're out of touch with what the audience wants, right? Remember, like Billy Wilder couldn't get a job, right?
Which is astounding, really.
Really, that's, you know, astounding. Somehow he forgot how to be a director. But the argument always was, well, you're not in touch with, you know, what audiences want today, or something like that. So I'm not surprised. And then, of course, Peter had such a complicated personal life. I don't know if any of you know about, he married this woman, Dorothy Stratton, you know, this beautiful model who wound up being murdered by her ex-boyfriend. And then he married Dorothy's sister. Is that correct?
Yeah, it got very odd. Very odd. His life got very, when he tells it, it's very sad.
He never should have left Polly Platt. That's all I can think of. You know, that would have made a big difference.
But he'll say the last thing is, you know, he where it all completely blew. He still had a shot. Was he? And I thought this was the epitome, if you want to talk about ego, I guess, or taking the wrong road, is that he had done a film. I don't know if it was Warner's or Paramount, but I think it was called They All Laughed with Dorothy Stratton.
Yeah, all They Laughed. That's the one with Dorothy Stratton.
Right, and then he got
all laugh, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, something. And he got into an argument with the studio over the marketing. So he decided to distribute the movie himself. So he put all of his money into it, which was at that time $5 million something.
Yeah.
And he lost it all.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He became desperate. And so after that,
it's like something Coppola would have done, you know.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's that kind of crazy business, and it does take a certain energy and confidence and sort of blind faith, and it's not easy to keep going. And you know, it's funny. I was reading a story about when they had the first big screening finally of What's Up, Doc, and people were in the theater, you know, all the Hollywood types, and no one knew exactly what they were watching, you know, because no one had made a screwball comedy like this for so long. And no one was really, you know, sure if they were supposed to laugh or not, you know. And what happened is after about 10 minutes into the movie, John Cassavetes, who was there, you know, the famous director, right, and actor, he stands up in the audience and he shouts out, "I can't believe he's doing this." And the whole audience broke up laughing, of course. And after that, they just loved the movie. You know, because you know how people are uncomfortable with comedy sometimes. They're not sure, is that over the top? Is it funny? Is it not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And think about it, you know, it really was the first time. I don't think there's been a screwball comedy for maybe, what, 25, 30 years, maybe?
Yeah, people weren't doing that. That had sort of died out. There was melodrama. There was, you know, serious films, you know, being made, you know, The Graduate. I mean, there were comedies, but, you know, they were within a serious dramatic context. They weren't, you know, just out and out, just fun, you know, and just being, you know, silly and spontaneous. And, you know, again, what I really love about this film is, and this is hard to kind of describe, but it had life to it. You know, it had a looseness to it. And when I worked with Coppola, he used to talk about that all the time. He said the biggest problem with movies is that they're much too overdeveloped. You know, they're too, you know, they're too planned, they're canned. You know, the actors rehearse their lines to death, and then, you know, and know exactly how they want to say them, and the cameraman wants to control the shots and make all the lighting and make the actors hit their marks exactly perfectly. And so there's something about it that doesn't feel life-like. And that's what, you know, the great director, and that's what Francis always tried to do, was just to bring that spirit of, you know, the moment and into the film. And I think somehow, you know, Bogdanovich obviously did understand that and was able to duplicate that here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
He knew all of also that classic, what do they call it, the rule of threes, you know, where that's how, you know, great comedy, you know, you always do something, but then you do it 3 times. And one of my favorite scenes, of course, is with all the cars and the chase, each one has to smash the Volkswagen, right? You know, and then and each time they smash it, it's a bigger laugh. You know, so then there are 3 cars and each, you know, smash them up. And then the guy comes out, you know, not, you know, owns that Volkswagen bus and he doesn't know what's going on and he opens the door and the whole thing collapses.
Well, that's the thing that's amazing about him, is that from not being a comedic guy before that, but just he basically learned by watching.
That's right.
And could extrapolate from the great guys.
And study.
It's very uncommon for a guy to go. I mean, I guess Woody Allen had that ability, but he was a writer. I mean, he knew the rhythm by actually being able to do it. So I was amazed that he nailed it like the way he did. I have to say, when I watched it the other night, I was very
this idea of you know, of being able to, because, you know, people think of comedy as kind of improvised or silly, but, you know, it's actually very hard to do, and it's hard to write, isn't it?
Oh, it's. I mean, there's that old saying, you know, comedy's harder than drama. It's not that it's harder. It's just that when you're at a party and you're with somebody who really genuinely makes you laugh,
right.
Sometimes it's just the way it's their rhythm, it's their pauses, it's sort of these innate things that make someone just whatever they say is funny. I mean, there's joke funny if someone tells a funny, but even in the telling of a good joke, it doesn't have to be that funny and just telling it in a funny way. And it's just you can't. It's one of those things that I think that's what always comes down to. You can't really teach comedy. It's either you're funny or you're not. And I'm sorry, I wish I had some rules for you. Like I could give you rules for drama, or I give you rules for, you know, how to do a thriller. But you know something's funny, it's by just people laugh, and that's it. There's really no way to define it or say this is how it works.
Are there any other comedy directors or writers working now that you particularly admire? Or?
I thought there were, although I thought that there were some inspired moments from the duo, you know, McKay, who does those Will Ferrell, some of the early Will Ferrell movies.
The early Will Ferrell, he's a
very. But the movies not as a whole hold up, but moments. But as far as the last movie that I thought was as funny as this from beginning to end, where I go, that's a hysterical movie, was The Birdcage.
Yeah. That was very well written.
And just the way it was, you know, it had that same.
Was that Mike Nichols?
Mike Nichols.
Yeah, well, he obviously knew comedy.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, if there's someone at the helm that knows, you know, how to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think these days a lot of people come at sort of the Judd Apatow school of comedy, you know, and let's be, you know, kind of R-rated and you know, and try to be, you know, and with all the sexual innuendos or fart jokes or drug jokes. It you know, there was something very pure about this, right? It wasn't, you know, so much comedy is often about making fun of somebody else, right? And here you didn't feel like there was the victim of the comedy, maybe a little with Eunice, you know, with Madeline Kahn, you know, the fiance, but again, she was just such an outrageous character to begin with. You didn't have to worry about her or feeling sorry for her. But I
think it was probably what you said. I think it was Buck Henry's script. I think it was probably so well structured and so well written that they just sort of said, as long as we follow this blueprint, we're not going to be able to screw up that badly. And I think he's so talented.
And again, I think, you know, and then Barbara is just so sweet, you know, so there's sort of this kindness and caring. And of course, the scene at the courtroom, right, when you find out that judge, who I forget that actor's name, he was fantastic, you know. And I have to take the blue pill to remind me to take the yellow pill.
And wasn't that her father in the movie? Didn't she say that?
Yeah, and then it's her father, right?
Yeah.
She's hiding under the blanket. She says, "Hi, Daddy." because you kind of knew that this was an unusual, I mean, because she was so well educated, and, you know, I mean, you couldn't quite figure out what her story really was, but it didn't really matter. It just, again, that's just great writing. That's just great writing. Who would have
I
thought?
wonder if she was happy with her performance. I never asked him.
She wasn't supposedly. Supposedly she didn't love this movie. She wasn't a huge fan of it. And she kind of felt it didn't, I don't know what she felt and why. Maybe she broke up with Ryan O'Neal, so that's one of the reasons she didn't like it anymore. But she was never a huge fan of this movie until later. I think, you know, if, you know, years later, she finally recognized that she had, you know, been fortunate enough to be involved with this very, very classic film. But at the time, I don't think it was that she, you know, hated doing it or hated Bogdanovich. But from what I understand, she wasn't really, you know, a giant fan of it. She just maybe didn't, you know, again, it was very unusual and different for the time. And maybe that's not what the direction she wanted her career to go in or what. But I can't think of another movie, certainly another comedy, where she gives a performance like this. You know?
Let me ask you something. When he had finished this film and it came out and he had not failed yet, so he had 2 box office success and both critical. Do you think at that time he literally could have done any? His third movie
he could have. So what happened, if you remember, he became part of something called the First Directors Company. It was Bogdanovich, Coppola, and William Friedkin. And they made a deal with Paramount. I guess it was Bob Evans. I can't remember, but this would have been right after this movie, you know, and you know, and they decided they would form this new company, and they made a deal, I believe it was Paramount, where they could make any film they wanted as long as it was $4 million or less. They basically were greenlit to make whatever they wanted to make. And Bogdanovich threw into this new company, Paper Moon. And that was one of the movies made for this director's company. And Paper Moon, of course, was very successful and made lots of money. And the idea was they split the profits of each other's movies. And Coppola made The Conversation. The Conversation was actually also produced by this new company, the director's company. And of course, although The Conversation was a huge critical success and, you know, won Cannes, Palme d'Or, and it didn't make any money. And I'm not sure what Friedkin did. I don't know if Friedkin ever did a movie. But they actually, this was that kind of moment where they had, you know, Francis did Godfather, and Friedkin, I guess, I don't know, had he done The Exorcist already? Maybe he had. But they really had carte blanche to do anything they wanted under a certain budget. And it should have been fantastic. It was going to be like a United Artists. I mean, Francis would tell me about this company and their dreams of what they thought this could be. But after, you know, like a year and a half or 2 years, it all fell apart because, of course, you know, the only one that made money was Paper Moon. And, you know, Bogdanovich wasn't so happy about having to share the profits, you know, with everybody else. And then they wanted Francis to go do Godfather 2, and he wasn't really around anymore. And so, you know, anyhow, you can imagine that it's always political and complicated, but that was a period where he could really have done anything he wanted. And the fact that he chose to do Paper Moon, you know, very small, kind of interesting little drama, and to shoot in black and white, you know, again, that was in black and white, and that was 73, you know, and $2
million, I think that movie was.
Yeah, excuse me?
I think it was like $2.2 million for that.
Yeah, and it was, you know, it was done for very low budget, but fantastic performances and you know, Academy Award nominations and everything else, right? So, you know, I don't know. You know, I think, you know, what, you know, everybody does, or not everybody, but some of these great, you know, people do have their chance and what they make of it and how they do it. But you know, again, it's sad to see that he went through such struggle later in his life. You know, it really is, because he was such a brilliant guy. So let's see. Are there any questions? Anybody want to ask Harris anything about the movie or about his own career, or any comments about the film? Because you know, we'd love to hear more about it. Somebody threw in that about the numbers that so $1 million in 1972 is equivalent to $6 million in 2020. So the $66 million would have been $412 million gross, right, if you were counting today,
Yeah.
and which I think is absolutely true. And then David tells us, of course, that I believe you're saying that Kenneth Mars was the preacher in Blazing Saddles, and of course was in Young Frankenstein. There's a lot of incestual relationship here between Mel Brooks and some of these actors, and Buck Henry and Bogdanovich, and where they all, and I guess it's because it's comedy, right? And this is the world of.
And I think back then, yeah, even being from Canada, and I have my brother Daniel and Ivan Reitman. They're 10 years older, but you tend to sort of stick with this clique of like actors and writers, and wherever you go, you kind of tend to use the same. Once you find your actors, you kind of tend to want to work with them over and over again, and the same writers and the same composers. And it's a little family that now is not the same. It's
very hard to repeat that these days. Everybody's just going for the big paycheck and wherever offers it. But that was a big deal, of course, for Coppola. He always used similar actors. Freddie Forrest was always in the movies, and and he always used the same production designer, DP, and editor.
Well, you were right in the
because you got it's such a high wire act to begin with, right? To making a movie. And you got to have people around you who you trust, because you're going to fall, you're going to fail, and you want someone there who can catch you, right? And and if you don't know these people, and they could have won Academy Awards, they could be famous people, but they may not have your best interest at heart, right? I mean, as a director, sometimes the struggles you can have with a DP or a costume designer who has their own way that they think it should be done. Right?
That's right. That's very true. And if you hook up with a fabulous DP, but he wants to direct, he can make it. So
often, when you look at John Ford, he had that Ford company of actors he used in every movie. Preston Sturges, right? William Demarest, I think, was in 7 Preston Sturges.
That's right.
He used these same actors again and again because he could trust them. Right, he knew that they would come through for him, and that they would, if there was a way to make it better, they'd find a way to make it better. And so I agree. I don't see that happening quite the same way. I guess if you think about Judd Apatow, he uses his wife a lot, and some of them, and Seth Rogen. I think you have that little Jonah Hill kind of gang that that does movies together. So I don't think it's completely gone, but again, I just remember these guys in those days. They were making movies. Every year you made a movie, right? Even the most successful directors now, it takes 3 years or 4 years to make a movie. By the time it finally gets greenlit, and and you go through all the post production, people. I mean, of course, in the 30s they were making 5 movies a year, right? If you were Carol Lombard or or Clark Gable, you were under contract and you just showed up and you made a movie every 2 months. So it's very, very sad in a way what's happened now. But I guess you could say some of this has been replaced by television, right? So you've also worked in television as well, and is that a very different experience for you than films and the creative?
Yeah, television it's really not the new. It's features are they're almost a lost leader now. I mean, they're so expensive. Nobody will take a flyer on a feature unless there's some kind of made up guarantee. It's based on a book or intellectual property or a comic book. They want to know, will this thing make us $500 million? And if it isn't, we're not that interested. So TV is much more, and then TV's becoming, it's because it's not so much advertised based anymore. It's more like, how do we put something on that's so different that's going to attract, people to pay for another month of subscription.
Cut through the clutter. Yeah. So Arlene wants to know, what are you working on, Harris? What's happening to you these days? And what outside of your teaching at McMaster? I mean,
I've got a couple of films that I was supposed to do a Miramax film here before the COVID thing, which got put on hold, that would have been
as
fun.
A director as well.
Yeah, it was a script I'd written, and it was over at Paramount with Lorenzo de Bonaventura, we couldn't get it going. And then Miramax picked it up
Right.
to do it as a lower budget film. We were going to shoot in Toronto. So the idea was I was going to teach,
Perfect.
finish the Toronto class, go on to the movie, and that would have been great. But then COVID.
And all got shut down.
I'm doing a pilot for the CBC.
Oh, that's cool. A
which is-
comedy or?
No, it's an hour drama that they
Okay.
seem to like, and then I've written 3 or 4 pilots while I've been here and
Yeah.
cooped up, and amazingly, I think I get people to read them more now with COVID because they're all at home and they have nothing to do. So when you say, "Hey,
Yeah, nothing's in production to take up all their
Nothing's in
time, so the executives can pay attention to development. And,
yeah," so it's an interesting, but I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, it's quite a. But the only thing I can control is writing. So I just try to constantly come up with new stuff on the feature front and TV front. Although now I like movies better, but I'd probably like to get a series going just because I've seen so many movies fall apart that
yeah.
on Friday were.
And then even if it gets made and it's good, how does it get distributed?
And then it gets lost. I've done a number of, written and directed a number of, smaller films that have gotten on all the platforms, and they just become. It's like.
I'm gonna put a plug in for a great film that that Harris wrote and directed called Numb. It stars Matthew Perry.
Oh, thanks.
What year was that?
2008.
Okay. Anyhow, if you haven't seen Numb, can people find it streaming, or do you know where it is?
Yeah, it's on Amazon and it's on.
Really interesting film, and we had the pleasure of showing it at the Westdale before we closed. And Harris came by, and I think it's an interesting film to watch today. I think you were a little ahead of your time in terms of the character and some of the psychological struggle he was going through. I have a feeling there are more and more people today who probably relate to this guy. And,
I think then no one knew what it was about, and now it's like, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a bizarre time.
Yeah. Oh, I know. And it'll be interesting to see what comes out of it creatively, right? And what's going to happen, and what kind of stories are people going to write, and what kind of films are people going to want to watch? Because nobody knows, and how's this going to affect kind of the future of movies and entertainment. We still do not know when we can open the movie theater again. We're hoping September 1st, but no one really knows what's going on and how and when we want to open. And we know we can do safe distancing, and when we can, we will open the theater and we'll be safe and we'll have all the protocols and everything else. But, attendance will be 30%, there'll be limits of what you're allowed to do. So,
but you're doing some live programming, I know, from the
so we're doing a music series. Thank you. I'll certainly remind anybody who's watching. On Thursday nights, we have a live music broadcast. And what we do is it's the Hamilton musicians, and they're on stage at the Westdale, but with no audience. So it's a little like the film clubs we're doing, which also you should find out about, these film talks. And this week it's Tom Wilson, quite a well-known local Hamilton musician. And everybody's volunteering, like we are, and then and the host is one of our board members, actually, a guy named Mike McCurley, a local musician, and it's sort of a performance talk, kind of little, and inside the music scene of Hamilton, and Tom, of course, grew up here, and was a musician here. Mike McCurley was actually in Daniel Lanois' band when he was 17 years old or something, and so it's quite a fun little series, and anybody who's interested in music and Hamilton musicians, that's something to watch. And everything you can find will either be on our Facebook page, the Westdale, or our YouTube channel, which I don't even know the name of, but I think you'll find out all that information at our website. So if you go to thewestdale.ca, you'll be able to see what's going on. I guess that's about it. We're going to wrap up. We always try to keep this to an hour. Of course, we're all volunteers. We're all doing this to kind of keep things alive. We don't charge any admission for any of the programming we're doing, but of course we would, accept donations. We're a charity, a charitable organization, so we actually can give tax receipts for your donations. And if you want to help us out during the time, it would be much appreciated. And again, if you go to the westdale.ca, you'll find out more about that. And then, of course, our hope is, soon enough we'll open and we'll start to show films and have guests like Harris back down to the Westdale to present movies and talk about movies. And anyhow, I just really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And if any of you are McMaster students, look for Harris's classes, hopefully in the fall. And see you soon. So thank you so much, everybody. Also, next week, I won't be here, but the host is a fellow named Nathan Fleet, who is the head of the Hamilton Film Festival. And they'll be discussing Cameron Crowe's movie, Almost Famous. And that's, did you ever meet Cameron, Harris? Do you know him at all?
Yeah, in fact, I used the last film I shot a year and a half ago, Patrick Fugit, the kid who stars.
Oh, yeah, Patrick Fugit, yeah.
And he stars in the latest one.
That's right, in your film, yeah. So if you haven't seen Almost Famous, it's a wonderful film. It's sort of inside the music scene. And Cameron Crowe was a Rolling Stone, reporter, so he really knew that world. And is it Kate Hudson's first movie? I think so.
Kate Hudson and I think James Brooks.
James Brooks was, yeah. So anyhow, this is what we're doing, and anybody, has suggestions of movies to talk about, or again, check out the film clubs, and hopefully one day soon we'll see you at the movies. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Fred.